Okay, September 25, 2025. Today was my pessimism day. I didn't get to read as much as I would have liked to, but I did finish. Well, that's not a great way to start it off. But I did finish Osamu Dazai's No Longer Human. I really like this book. I really like Osamu Dazai's writing. I think it just depicts such despair. But in a way that doesn't sort of overly romanticize it. The book is very self-destructive. And it attempts to self-destruct multiple times and never really actually relieves that tension. And I think it could have. I think it could have. But it also is just as good having not done so. Because it could have gone out with a firework or something, or like a bang or something like that, but it really just it doesn't feel like a question mark per se. Not totally, but yeah, I'm still sitting with this. I should. Well, I don't. Should is a strong word, but I intend to read more of his work. I have a couple quotes. This is what I was told. This is what I was, a toad. It was not a question of whether or not society tolerated me, whether or not it ostracized me. I was an animal lower than a dog, lower than a cat, a toad. I sluggishly moved, that's all. I suppose this surprised me because it turns out that I guess people look at toads in a sort of negative light. I haven't seen that many toads, so I haven't had the opportunity to be disgusted in that way. But in another book that I read later on that I'll discuss a little bit more in a bit, I did read Arthur Schopenhauer's On Aesthetics, and he has a moment in which he's describing terrifying or horrific animals. And I'll just read this quote real quick. The similarity between the toad and mud and dirt seemed to produce the same effect, although this is inadequate to explain boundless repugnance. Indeed, terror and horror, which overcomes many people at the sight of this animal, and it does others in the case of the spider. This seems rather to originate in a much deeper metaphysical and mysterious connection. Now I'm trying to think back when to, yeah, because I have seen like frogs. I guess there is a sort of sliminess to them, but yeah, to find those two references to a toad back to back struck me as interesting or worth noting. I'm trying to say interesting less because whatever. Okay, and then the next quote, the final one, from No Longer Human. Society, I felt as though even I were beginning at last to acquire some vague notion of what it meant. It is the struggle between one individual and another, a then and there struggle, in which the immediate triumph is everything. Human beings never submit to human beings. And then it goes on, I skip a few lines. The incomprehensibility of society is the incomprehensibility of the individual. The ocean is not society, it is individuals. I guess this is a moment in which the narrator begins to understand the order of things in his own way, having been a very passive character up until this point. And sort of in this newfound structure or relationship, it just then ends up shifting his perspective on, I suppose, what relationships in society are, allowing him to be more active and, to an extent, to express his feelings more so than he did before. But the ocean is not a society, it is individuals that, that's just, it stands as something worth being contemplated. Okay, and then I started We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. He is a Russian writer. I might have totally butchered his name, but this guy is an OG sci-fi. Yeah. Sort of, I think some thread said like a negative sci-fi utopia. I guess it's more dystopian, but I suppose George Orwell was inspired by this, and so is the book 1984. But yeah, his syntax, or his use of it, how do I describe? In the introduction, the way he writes is elaborated on. The way he writes is elaborated on, and you wanna go outside? And so, in a way that, I guess the author used to be an engineer, and he sort of strips language to, maybe it's bare necessities, but in a way that still feels like engaging and prose, like even the way he has the chapters of the book, it's in records, and so he'll put record 1 keywords, a declaration, the wisest of lines, an epic, and that's and these will all appear throughout the chapter, and they're sort of like little markers, but yeah, really, really interesting. Oh my gosh, interesting. Here I go, saying things I shouldn't be. My brother is an English major, and he said that his it doesn't matter. One of his teachers just said something about the word interesting, and it is something that sort of becomes a default word for anything worth noting. But okay, on language, I suppose Zamyatin wrote quite a bit on language in literature. If you try to follow the language of thought in your own mind, you will not find even the simplest sentences, only shreds, fragments of simple sentences. Only the most essential elements of a sentence are used, sometimes only a verb or only an epithet, an object. At first glance, this assertion may seem paradoxical. Why should fragments of sentences, scattered as after an explosion, have greater effect on the reader than the same thoughts and images arranged in regular, steady marching ranks? Because you meet the reader's natural instinctive need. You do not compel him to skim. And I just thought that was really interesting. And being an engineer, he does use sort of a lot of, the introduction said he uses a number of syllogisms to sort of explain. So it's very logical is what I'm trying to say, but it doesn't exclude the reader from being, from not understanding the sort of logical way of explaining things. So, yeah, it's I really like this story. I have the translation by Natasha Randall. I've heard there's some. It's by like modern library classics. So I've heard there's some iffy translations of this, but this one I really like. I have one quote marked down. I'm not super far in it, but it's the narrator is describing it's a book from in the like mindset of someone in the future. And so looking back on humanity, he says, their faculties of reason may not have been developed, but they must have understood more broadly that living like that amounted to mass murder. Literally, only it was committed slowly, day after day. The state humanness, forbade killing to death any one person, but didn't forbid the half-killing of millions. To kill a man, that is, to decrease the sum of a human lifespan by 50 years, this was criminal. But decreasing the sum of many humans' lives by 50 million years, this was not criminal. Isn't that funny? It's on page 13, I guess, because, to give a little bit more context, the people in this, the humans in this story have a pretty strict schedule that's down to like the hour. So every hour of the day is sort of reserved for a specific activity or event. And so he's criticizing right before it goes into that. It says, various historians even say, apparently in those times, lights burned on the streets all night long, and all night long people rode and walked the streets. So he's referencing a life that is without schedule, the sort of lives that we live today. So without the scheduled walks, without the precise regulation of meal times, getting up and going to bed whenever it occurred to them. But the chapters are called records. I'm only 5 in, but man, am I really excited to keep reading that. It's been a while since I've been interested in dystopian sci-fi stuff. Even though, like, one of my favorite books before was The Giver. When I read that in like middle school, maybe 6th grade, 7th grade, and I'm pretty sure that's a dystopian novel. I haven't read that in a really long time though. Okay, then now to the big hitter, Arthur Schopenhauer's Essays and Aphorisms. I read On Aesthetics today, and it was pretty hard not to just underline everything. I mean, actually, I didn't underline everything, but there were lots of blocks because it's just everything was hard to not underline because it was just so full. Okay, so I don't want to go too long with this and just be reading off a ton of okay. When an aesthetic perception occurs, the will completely vanishes from consciousness. So Arthur Schopenhauer's thing is like the will to live. Like the will is sort of the source of, or like the human drive. I'm definitely flattening it. There's definitely more to it than that. But the will is sort of our means of doing things. As we know, the world as will is the primary, and the world as idea is the secondary world. The former is the world of desire, and consequently that of pain and thousandfold misery. The latter, however, is in itself intrinsically painless. In addition, it contains a remarkable spectacle, altogether significant, or at the very least entertaining. Enjoyment of this spectacle constitutes aesthetic pleasure. So throughout this, he really begins to set up the stage for breaking down his ideas on different types of art. It'll range from music to plastic, plastic arts, things like molding, or that can be molded or shaped like pottery, or for no reason I think of like glass blowing. Okay, so when contemplating an object, I abstract its position in space and time, and thus abstract its individuality. Only when this position is done away with will the object become an idea, and I, therewith, a pure subject of knowledge. For only in the condition of pure knowledge where will and its aims have been completely removed from man, but with them its individuality also, can that purely objective perception arise, and with the Platonic ideas of things will be comprehended. Works of genius owes its origin to precisely the fact that primal artistic knowledge is entirely separated and independent of will, is willless. So if I'm understanding this correctly, and taking away and solely looking at it from this sort of second world, the secondary world of the world as idea, we get to sort of more experience this painless aesthetic pleasure that we get to enjoy, and to do so we have to separate the will from the idea. The world is as well as the primary. Yeah. So the world is will. We have to separate that and look at it as two different things. And in doing that, we can sort of appreciate a piece of art to its full potential, I suppose, but potential feels like a catch-all, like I don't know. Okay, he goes on to say, the nature of art, however, is such that in art one single case stands for thousands. A scene from human life depicted correctly and completely leads to a clear and profound knowledge of the idea of humanity itself, perceived from this or that aspect. I do skip around. So the poet selects a single scene, sometimes no more than a single mood or sensation, from the endless confusion of ceaselessly active human life, in order to show us what the life and nature of man is, for the particular and individual can be grasped only when it is made visible, which is why I have defined poetry as the art of setting the imagination into action by means of words. Okay. Yeah, that was a pretty nice bit on poetry. Maybe I should just friggin' open the book. But no, I wrote these down for a reason. Okay. Then he talks about even waxwork figures and sort of the uncanniness that they excrete. The waxwork figure appears to present the individual itself. That is to say, that which exists only once and never again, but without that which leads value to such a fleeting existence without life. That is why the waxwork evokes a feeling of horror. It produces the effect of a rigid corpse. Yeah, I guess so. The waxwork figure is hollow-like, but at the same time it resembles it. But also, unlike the form of stone, wax is subject to the elements. I mean, stone is too, but wax more so, especially or more so severely, especially to temperature, particularly heat. And so it does end up having that brevity of existence under a given circumstance, or under temperature. I suppose stone isn't exactly the same. And when I say stone, I mean I refer to like classical sculpture. And then he even goes to talk about music, which was super interesting because I I used to okay. Music is the true universal language which is understood everywhere. I feel like this is a significant melody which says a great deal soon makes its way around the earth, while a poor in meaning which says nothing straight away fades and dies, which proves that the content of a melody is very well understandable. Music speaks not of things, but of pure weal and woe, which are the only realities for the will. That is why it speaks to the heart, while it has nothing to say directly to the head, and it is a misuse of it to demand that it should do so. If you go like further back into my channel, you do see I used to make music. I put like a few albums out or whatever, but very, very back in the day when I was like in high school, I studied under a opera singer who was sort of my music composition mentor, and he just taught me a lot about theory and a lot of classical music. But it's funny because then right after it, he goes into like followed up with completely just shitting on opera, and he was like, my mentor was like a super big opera singer, so not a super when I say super big, I mean he was super big into it, and so that just made me crack up because I'll just read this. Strictly speaking, one could call opera an unmusical invention for the benefit of unmusical minds, inasmuch as music first has to be smuggled in through a medium foreign to it. For instance, as the accompaniment to a long drawn-out, insipid love story in its poetic pap. For a spirited, compact poem, full of matter, is of no use as an opera text, because the composition cannot be equal to such a poem. A lot of poems are sort of adapted to operas. That was a pretty, Then earlier on he said, grand opera is not really a product of the pure artistic sense. It is rather a somewhat barbaric conception of enhancing aesthetic enjoyment by piling up the means to it. And then he ends it off. Through all this, it is distracted and confused, and its attention is diverted because there's like so much stuff going on. The argument is that music by itself is enough. Like just listening to it, that's it. But with the distraction of the visuals, like the costumes, he says the person is just like thrown off and isn't able to experience what it truly is, like the beauty of the music. And that's pretty funny to me. I do want to say earlier on, he did talk about nature and vegetation, and this is like pretty rad. Inorganic nature, provided it does not consist of water, produces a very melancholy, indeed oppressive impression upon us when it appears without anything organic. The sadness of this impression produced upon us by the inorganic derives first and foremost from the fact that the inorganic mass is subject exclusively to the law of gravity, the direction of which consequently dictates everything. His example that he uses is an instance is provided by the regions of bare rock without any vegetation in the long valley near Toulon, through which runs the road to Marseille. But the deserts of Africa offer a much more grandiose and impressive example. I think immediately of the Sufi mystics, and I haven't read enough of their writings yet to be able to comment much about it, but it is something I'm very interested in and intend to in the future. But I'm curious as to how that expanse of this melancholic, oppressive impression changes according to their perspective, because I imagine someone who isn't from that region, particularly a Schopenhauer, will have the European will have a different idea of what that could be. Okay, so then further on the other hand, we derive a high degree of immediate pleasure from the sight of vegetation. The immediate reason for this lies in the fact that in vegetation, the law of gravity seems to have been overcome. And so I guess he goes further on to say, we sort of identify ourselves in this order of things, saying, let's see. The immediate reason for this lies in the fact that in vegetation the law of gravity seems to have been overcome, and that the plant world raises itself in precisely the opposite direction from the one dictated by this law, so gravity, and thus directly proclaims the phenomenon of life as a new and higher order of things. We ourselves are part of that order. It is that in nature which is related to us, the element of our existence. Our heart is uplifted in presence of it. What pleases us first and foremost at the sight of the plant world, therefore, is its vertical upward direction. And a group of trees gains vastly from having a couple of straight rising pointed fir trees in its midst. So I guess it does. That was interesting. Oh God, interesting. That was. Why is it interesting? Maybe it's following up with why. It was why. It gives it substance, but or the word interesting, but. The aesthetics of nature. And then he even goes on to say the melancholy effect of the inorganic nature of water is in large part abolished by its great mobility, which produces an impression of life, and by its constant play with light is moreover the primal condition of life. Yeah, I didn't expect him to be talking about nature, but him talking about plants was super interesting to me. Oh God, interesting. It reminded me of some of the legends that I was talking about in my hermeneutics and alchemy day that I did post last week. Sort of the almost religious or reverence for plants and their incorporation of them into certain rituals and the way one appreciates and looks differently at them. There is a connection to be made there. And then a little fun one he threw in the ninth part, or I guess essay, part 9. A man who tries to live on the generosity of the muses, I mean on his poetic gifts, seems to me somewhat to resemble a girl who lives on her charms, or a boy, or whoever, someone who lives on their charms. Okay. They profane for base profit what ought to be the free gift of their inmost being. Both are liable to become exhausted, and both usually come to a shameful end. And he wraps it up with, so do not degrade your muse into a whore. Okay. And then the first step is the hardest, talking about narrative, or he even says drama in general as the most perfect reflection of human existence. And then he goes on to explain it, but I guess there's 3 modes of comprehending it. The first is most infrequently encountered at the stage, is what merely is interesting. On the second stage, drama becomes sentimental, and then at the highest and hardest stage, the tragic is aimed at. We are deeply affected, and the sensation of the will's turning away from life is aroused in us, either directly or as a simultaneously sounding harmony. Okay, almost over. Then he goes further on in the last section. The first step is the hardest, says the popular adage, but in dramaturgy, the reverse is true. The last step is the hardest. It is easier to confuse things than to straighten them out again. So, talking about It's pretty self-explanatory, just narrative. And then he says, a novel, and this will be the higher and nobler, the more inner and less outer life it depicts. The art lies in setting the inner life into the most violent motion with the smallest possible expenditure of outer life, for it is the inner life which is the real object of our interest. The task of the novelist is not to narrate great events, but to make small ones interesting. And that's just fucking, I mean, that's, if you're into writing novels, if that's like something you want to do, that's like a key. I mean, if you want to write a version of like Schopenhauer's novel, that's like a key instance. But I guess it's something that he's noticed in reading others as well. Yeah, so I got 30 minutes from that. I think I just spit a little bit, please. But yeah, so sorry if I just read a bunch of quotes, but they were curated in a sort of way, but that's not to mean that it's like better than anything else. I mean, whatever. Yes, this is my pessimism day. I mean, but this wasn't entirely pessimistic. I mean, Arthur Schopenhauer is the whatever. He's not the whatever, but I'm just saying whatever. Almost done with it though. Yep. Okay. Well, I'm glad I got to talk about this. So yeah. Okay. Into the next day, I suppose. Bye-bye.